Do you get confused by the mode dial on your camera? I get questions about it all the time in class. So in this video, we'll take a closer look and clarify the options. And I'll explain which modes you should ignore if you want to be a better photographer. The mode dial can seem confusing at first, and they vary slightly from camera to camera. But what if I told you that you only have to worry about 3 options most of the time? I'll explain what the mode dial is, what those main 3 options are, 2 options that you may use occasionally, and why you should ignore all the other choices. And if you watch until the end, I'll share a bonus with you about the best mode to choose in any given situation. So without any further ado, let's take a good look at the mode dial. The mode dial is simply a circular switch you can use to set your camera into one of the various modes or operations that it has available. Each mode is indicated by a well-designed icon. However, these icons do vary slightly from manufacturer to manufacturer. The biggest difference I've noticed is between Canon and Nikon, which I'll explain later. For now though, the obvious place to start is full auto mode. Not a great deal to say about full auto really. It's usually highlighted in green, and in this mode the camera makes every decision for you except focusing and when to press the shutter. Auto has its place, but basically this is point and shoot mode and best forgotten. Cameras that are geared towards photographers just starting out have scene modes such as portrait, sports, night and macro. As you can see on my old Canon 60D, these settings are depicted by the various icons. Scene modes are basically an enhancement of auto mode. The idea is that you can let the camera know what type or genre of photography you're shooting, and the camera does its best to give you what it thinks are the best settings for that situation. For example, if you select landscape mode, the camera will probably give you a small aperture like f11 for a larger depth of field, meaning that most, if not all, of the scene is in focus. In portrait mode, it'll do the opposite and choose an aperture such as f2.8 or the widest aperture your lens will allow to give you a nice out of focus background. One thing to mention here that is in auto and scene modes, if the camera detects that there's not enough light for a good exposure, it'll activate the pop-up flash. Now if you're shooting a landscape, this pop-up flash is totally useless. If you're shooting portraits, it's totally useless. If you want the worst portrait ever with the classic red eye look, then use the pop-up flash. In other words, use it on people you don't like to make them look terrible. Okay, joking aside, because it's a very small, harsh light, the best thing you can do with it is turn it off and forget it exists. If you need more light, you need to get your flash off camera. A large diffuse light source close to your subject gives a much kinder, softer light. But that's a topic for another video. Scene modes mean that you do at least need to know what genre you're shooting, but the only elements of photography you can really improve with auto and scene modes is your timing, composition and framing. In my opinion, and in the interest of becoming a better photographer, the best thing to do now you know about auto and scene modes is to completely forget all about them and never use them. If you want to be able to shoot quickly and not miss that special moment, there are better options available to you. So let's discuss which modes you should be using. If you want to take better pictures, you should be concentrating on what is known as the PASM modes. By the way, have you noticed that on my Canon 5 DSLR there are no scene modes? That's because this and other high-end cameras are aimed more at working photographers. And also, it doesn't have a pop-up flash. I rest my case. It does have auto mode, though I'm not sure why. I guess we'd have to ask Canon. P stands for program, not professional, as I've heard some say. Because it allows you to shoot in the RAW file format, program mode is good for those moments when getting the shot is far more important than setting the exposure yourself. Perfect for grabbing that moment in time and one of those 2 options I mentioned that you may use occasionally. So what's the difference between full auto and program mode? While full auto sets everything and locks you out of the decision-making process, program mode chooses a shutter speed and aperture combination, and that's all. You're still able to set your ISO, color balance, flash settings and exposure compensation. So why wouldn't you use program mode all the time? For a photograph like this, it may not always be the best option. Let's say your ISO is at 400, a decent average level with no image noise issues. The camera would pick maybe a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second and an aperture, say, of f8. However, 1/250th of a second may not be fast enough to freeze the action. You could make the shutter speed faster, maybe 1/500th of a second, and in program mode, the camera will adjust the aperture accordingly. However, if the sun went behind a cloud and the light levels dropped, the camera will slow the shutter speed and open up the aperture to let more light in. Your shutter speed may now be too slow to freeze the action. Program mode has no bias and is designed to pick an average setting for both shutter speed and aperture based on the meter reading. So what do you think would be a better choice in a situation where you want to totally freeze the action? Did you guess? If you want to freeze action, then shutter priority is a good choice. This is where the mode referencing or naming differs between Canon and Nikon. On Nikon, it's S for shutter, which makes total sense. On Canon, it's TV for time value, which may not make sense. The point is, you'll need to become familiar with the icons and naming on your particular camera. Shutter priority is one of the semi-automatic modes available, and it means that you can choose the shutter speed and the camera will choose an aperture to suit. If there's not enough light available to accommodate the shutter speed you've chosen, the camera will let you know. In the case of my Canon 5 DSLR, the aperture will blink. And presuming the use of flash or another light source is not possible, you then have two choices. You can either lower the shutter speed, which may then be too slow to freeze the action, or raise the ISO to make the sensor more sensitive to light. On most cameras, you can set the ISO to auto, and if digital noise is not an issue, this might be a good option. It'll certainly give you one less setting to think about. Okay, so have you worked out what the other semi-automatic mode is? It is, of course, aperture priority. Nikon calls it A for aperture, again nice and straightforward. Canon calls it AV for aperture value. Maybe they just like to be different. In this mode, when you select the aperture you want, the camera will choose an appropriate shutter speed in order to get an acceptable exposure. If the light levels change while you're taking a series of photographs, the camera will automatically alter the shutter speed to suit the conditions. For this reason, you have to be aware that the camera might set a shutter speed that's slow enough for camera shake to be an issue. If you're on a tripod though, camera shake is far less of a problem. Aperture priority is great when the depth of field you want to achieve is the most important element. Okay, now let's talk about the shooting mode I recommend you master as soon as you possibly can. Manual mode gives you full control of all the settings, allowing you to choose the exact exposure you want for any given situation. Aside from demonstrating to students, I can't recall the last time I shot in anything other than manual mode. It takes some practice and getting used to, but having total control is definitely worth the effort. You may have also noticed that on my Canon 5 DSLR, there are three other options: C1, C2 and C3. These are used for custom settings, as in C for custom. It means I can set a particular exposure combination that I use regularly, say 1/125th of a second, f8 at 100 ISO, and can then assign those settings to one of the custom buttons, which does speed things up a bit. Anyway, I'm not dismissing semi-automatic modes. They can definitely help, especially when you don't have time to keep an eye on all your settings. In fact, when I first got a DSLR 15 years ago, I started out using both shutter and aperture priority. However, because I'm confident in my ability to change settings quickly, I far prefer the benefits of manual mode. As promised, we're going to look at the best mode to choose for different situations. But first, let's talk about another mode you may use occasionally and for a specific situation. Not all cameras have bulb mode, but if yours does, it means you can keep the shutter open for as long as you'd like, from minutes to hours at a time. Most cameras have shutter speeds ranging from 1/1/4000th of a second, and maybe faster, all the way down to 30 seconds. But for longer than 30 seconds, you'll need bulb mode. Bulb mode can be used for capturing long exposure seascapes like my good friend Nigel Thomas, where you may need an exposure of 2 minutes or longer. Or you may be shooting star trails with the shutter open for hours at a time. In bulb mode, you press the shutter to start the exposure and then press again to stop it after it's been open for the required length of time. Okay, before that bonus tip about what mode to use when, if you haven't already done so, why not grab my ebook, The 3 Essential Pillars of Good Photography, by signing up for my monthly newsletter. I've had some really nice feedback and I'm sure you'd find it useful too. It's completely free and there's a link for you in the description below. So which of those three main modes do we use and when? Aperture priority could be a good choice when you're shooting landscapes because the high f-stop to achieve a large depth of field would be your priority. You would likely be on a tripod, so slowing down of the shutter speed due to changing light would be more or less irrelevant. Also, if you're taking a portrait and want that nice shallow depth of field with an out of focus background, you would need to choose a large aperture. Your shutter speed set by the camera will therefore likely be fast enough to eliminate any camera shake. Shutter priority is a natural choice for quick action such as any fast-moving activities, motorsports and fast-moving wildlife. It also allows you to pick a fast enough shutter speed to ensure that camera shake is eliminated, or otherwise slow the shutter down to get deliberate motion blur, such as in panning shots. So you already know this is my preferred shooting mode because it gives us the most control and can be used in any situation. In my opinion, if you want to improve your photography, you need to master manual mode to the point where you can quickly and easily alter settings for any scenario. Not only that, if you're shooting a high contrast scene, manual mode is definitely the best option. Another scenario is if you're doing a panoramic shot and stitching several images together. Manual mode keeps the same settings throughout the series of shots, which is exactly what we want. It's also worth mentioning that the shooting mode does not determine the exposure. The camera's metering system determines the exposure. The shooting mode decides how the exposure information will be applied with regard to the shutter speed, aperture and ISO. And that's true whether we are making all the choices in manual mode or the camera is helping us out in one of the semi-automatic modes. The various shooting modes is something I wish I'd have known all those years ago. And if you'd like to know of other things that would have helped me out when I first started, why not check out this video? If you got something from this, why not like and subscribe? It's free, really appreciated, and helps others that might find this channel useful. Thanks so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.